listener production.
Hi, Sasha Barber-Gatt with you. Welcome to The Briefing. If there's one group of people Donald Trump can usually rely on for support, it is far-right social media influencers. But right now, some of the biggest names on the conservative internet are turning against Trump's campaign.
I think what's happening now is Trump has lost the ability to set the narrative, and his inability, I think, to react and respond to the Democrats' really successful accusations that he and his campaign are weird. And, President Biden called him a loser the other day.
The right-wing war over how to reinvigorate Donald Trump's presidential campaign is coming up in the second half of this episode. First, though, it's time for the headlines with Katrina Blowers. It is Thursday, August 22.
Hi guys. Well, there are reports the bodies of tech millionaire Mike Lynch and his teenage daughter have been found after their super yacht sank off Sicily. 5 bodies have been recovered in the last day, with specialist divers scouring the wreckage to find the final victim. Now, they've only been able to spend 8 to 10 minutes underwater each trip, so this is why it's taken them so long, with reports that there have been a lot of furniture blocking their path when they've tried to enter the hull. Now, Lynch's $58 million super yacht went down on Monday local time when it was hit by a freak water spout called a black swan during a pre-dawn storm, and then it sank within minutes. So 15 people were rescued, among them Lynch's wife and a 1-year-old baby. Italian authorities are yet to formally identify the bodies they've found, though, Sasha, and they may not until the final person is found. Now, I was just talking then about this black swan weather event. You've been looking into this, Sasha, because I'd actually never heard of this before.
No, me neither. And the black swan term is used to describe an extremely rare weather event, something that could not be predicted or seen in advance. And that's what they're saying this water spout was. So it was this sudden and abrupt appearance. They've called it like a tornado-like water spout, which was this column of rotating air that formed over the body of water that the yacht was on. And that water spout could explain why the yacht sank so quickly. So there were other vessels in the area during this storm. They were all fine, but they think that the water spout caused really nasty damage to the yacht, and that's what caused it to sink. I saw a report that said it sank within a minute, which is just insane. That is so fast. So yeah, that black swan terminology is used to describe something that is just an absolute freak of nature. It's the penultimate day of the Democratic National Convention today, with Kamala Harris's running mate Tim Walz to headline. Bill Clinton will also speak at the event, along with some former Trump staffers who have switched sides. Yesterday, though, it was all about the former First Family, with Barack and Michelle Obama giving speeches to rapturous crowds.
Kamala knows, like we do, that regardless of where you come from, what you look like, who you love, how you worship, or what's in your bank account, we all deserve the opportunity to build a decent life.
We do not need 4 more years of bluster and bumbling and chaos. We have seen that movie before, and we all know that the sequel is usually worse. We are ready for a President Kamala Harris.
Yeah, we have seen some really intensely passionate speeches at the DNC so far, and the Obamas just continued it yesterday. Also, Lil Jon showed up and performed Turn Down for What, which he actually used as a song to encourage young people to vote in the 2016 election. He got all these celebs on board, and it was called Turn Out for What. So encouraging people to enroll to vote and to have their say in the election. Obviously, it's not compulsory in the US, so they really have to work hard to win young people over. John Legend is going to be there today. He's going to introduce Tim Walz. Also today, we've seen some new numbers that show the Harris campaign raised 4 times as much money in July than Trump's did. So the Harris campaign raked in more than 300 million Australian dollars. That's compared to Donald Trump's 70 million.
That is just wild. I'm so curious to see how Bill Clinton's speech is going to be received today, particularly in light of his shady past, which, I think if a lot of those details and allegations came to light today, he wouldn't fare so well. So I'm so curious to see how, he's going to stand the test of time, particularly in the context of all the other speakers that we've seen. Let's have a look at what Trump is up to. He's today spoken quite significantly at his first open air rally that has happened since the attempt on his life in Pennsylvania. He's done that in North Carolina. There's been quite an elaborate security setup. So there's been snipers everywhere. They've had these outdoor storage containers which can move around, that can block the view from externally to the area that he's speaking at. So people can shift them if they're starting to fear that crowds are starting to gather. And he's got sheets of bulletproof glass that are surrounding him. So taking absolutely no risks, but, still stepping out and speaking at an open air rally. So yeah, pretty interesting to see. Aldi has been dubbed Australia's best customer-rated supermarket for the 7th year in a row. The supermarket had the most satisfied shoppers in 2024, according to Canstar Blue's supermarket satisfaction ratings. It was one of the only supermarkets to score 5 stars for its value for money, freshness of produce, availability of deals and specials, store layout, and even the quality of its own branded products. Canstar Blue's editor-in-chief Christine Siebert said that one of the key attractions to Aldi is the low prices that retains customers, especially during the cost of living crisis. And Sasha, you and I have had super boring middle-aged chats off air about my love of Aldi. I reckon there's a full cult, people who, because it is definitely a different way of shopping and you do have to top up at the other supermarkets. So it's an effort to be an Aldi customer, right? But once you're kind of in that cult of Aldi, it's very hard to leave.
Yeah, I was really proud the other day. I did an Aldi shop and the checkout man praised me for how quickly I got the groceries into the bags because that's the biggest fear of Aldi. And I think, I'm not joking, that's what keeps people away is that, oh my God, I've got to pack my own bags, and they throw the groceries at me and I won praise. So that's a badge I'm wearing long into the future. And your hot girl summer just got a little bit more expensive. Aussies will now have to pay a new entry fee if they want to get into Europe from the start of next year. Look, the good news is it's only $11.50 and we are still exempt from having to get a visa. Up until now, it has been free for us to travel to the continent. But I guess, you don't like seeing a fee whacked onto your trip overseas, Katrina, but this will be valid for 3 years once you pay the $11.50. So maybe it's just an excuse to go to Europe a couple more times than you'd originally planned.
Oh, yeah. Everyone needs an excuse for that. But I think, we forget things like, for example, don't want to brag. Last week I was in Bali. You have to pay $50 before you enter that country for your visa. So, I think we often forget that this is just a standard thing that you need to do. And by comparison, $11.50 is a drop in the ocean, especially if it lasts for 3 years.
Exactly. Well, it's lovely to have you back from Bali, albeit for a short time. You are leaving us tomorrow, so we're going to lap up every single last second with you. But next up, it is our deep dive, and we're looking into whether right-wing influencers are starting to distance themselves from Donald Trump.
Hey, Bension here. Candace Owens once suggested the US should invade Australia to save us from tyrannical COVID policies. Laura Loomer has described herself as a proud Islamophobe. Nick Fuentes is a white supremacist who has praised Adolf Hitler. All of these people have also been big Donald Trump supporters, using huge social media platforms to advocate for the former president. And all of them have recently turned on Trump's campaign, threatening an internal war against it. They argued that his staff have allowed him to shift his policies and his rhetoric too far towards the centre, and that he needs to return to harder line stances if he wants to breathe life back into his his campaign, which has failed to regain momentum since Kamala Harris replaced Joe Biden on the Democratic ticket. So what's behind this dramatic turnaround? And are these people right about Trump's best strategy to get back into the White House? Dr. Emma Shortis is Senior Researcher for the International and Security Affairs Program at independent think tank the Australia Institute. Emma, welcome to the briefing. Talk us through some of the far-right influencers who are turning on Donald Trump's campaign.
The far-right influencers are mostly from, I suppose, the right-wing universe of podcasts, and they I wouldn't go as far as to say they're turning on Trump, but they're, I think, expressing their concern about his campaign. And these are people like Candace Owens, who is quite a famous influencer, a young black woman, and they've come out all at once, I suppose, to suggest that Trump's campaign is tanking, I suppose, is a nice way of putting it, and to offer their advice about how to fix that, most of which involves leaning into their own really far-right policy platform. So they're making the argument that he is not being conservative or radical enough, and that's why he's losing support.
Do you think that part of the reason for this is effectively a power reason? People have latched onto Trump in part because he has won quite a bit. He's lost as well. Do you think that they're just starting to panic?
I think that's absolutely part of it. These influencers in particular are very good at seeking out power within the right-wing universe, and that's exactly why they've attached themselves to Trump. And it's worth remembering that many of them were slow to do so, particularly in 2015, 2016, when it seemed far from certain that Trump would, even win the Republican nomination. They've since really tacked themselves on to Trump. But I think what we're seeing is their concern that he is losing that influence, he's losing power, he's particularly losing power to set the narrative of politics in the United States. So I think that's partly what we're seeing. These influencers have a view to after November and after the election and what the landscape will look like then. So I think they are somewhat hedging their bets and distancing themselves from Trump in case he loses. But the other thing I'd say is that it's also about money. It's also about these influencers holding on to their audiences, particularly their online audiences, and the revenue that they bring in. They don't want to be seen as being attached to a loser because they want to hold on to that influence with their own audiences.
Some of the basic argument that they are making is that he needs hard-line positions on things like immigration and race. And we know that Donald Trump does have a big advantage in the polls on that issue specifically. Are they right that he needs to go further to the right if he wants to win this election?
Look, I actually think that's a really difficult question to answer because the American electoral system makes that really unpredictable. So there's certainly a strategic argument for Trump embracing those right-wing policies, the Heritage Foundation's Project 2025 in particular, because that may well mobilise Trump's core base. Because, of course, in a system where you don't have compulsory voting, mobilising people to actually get out and vote is really critical. So that has a certain logic to it, to say that we need to mobilise Trump's base, Trump's right-wing base on issues like immigration, also issues like abortion, for example, in order to get them out to vote, particularly in those critical swing states where it can come down to a couple of thousand votes in order to win the Electoral College and therefore win the presidency. But there's also clearly this tension within the Trump campaign, and this has existed really from the beginning with Trump, that sees them every now and again realise that maybe they should be reaching out to quote-unquote independent voters or swing voters and appeal to them instead. And you can see that internal fight materialise quite often, in discussions, for example, about who Trump should pick as his vice presidential running mate. So there was a big argument internally that he should choose a woman, for example, to offset his weaknesses with women. And clearly the decision was made to not do that and to lean into that far-right base. That appears, for the moment at least, to have backfired pretty badly.
Do you think Donald Trump has ever found himself in such a difficult position where he's pulled in two completely different directions, because the Trump campaign has disavowed Project 2025. The Democrats have been using Project 2025 as the big scare campaign about Donald Trump. And at the same time, he's got these influencers who he usually could pretty much always rely on for their support, saying you need to get more extreme.
Yeah, it is an interesting question. As I said, I think that tension has always been there, and the reason Trump has been unsuccessful in distancing himself from Project 2025 is because it's so clear, how closely tied he is to it. He picked a vice presidential running mate who's really close friends with the president, or the former president now, of the Heritage Foundation, who wrote a foreword for his book. So the links are there and obvious. So he couldn't distance himself from it, or from those far right influences. I think what's happening now is Trump has lost the ability to set the narrative, and his inability, I think, to react and respond to the Democrats' really successful accusations that he and his campaign are weird, and President Biden called him a loser the other day. I think that's the bigger tension for Trump. He could get over the internal tensions between the far right and the kind of conservative right. What he can't seem to get over is his campaign's inability to counter the Harris campaign and the kind of joyful vibes of the Harris campaign. If he returns to being able to set the narrative, which is entirely possible, he's done that before, I think a lot of those tensions will disappear.
Do you think that the best strategy for him to reset the narrative from a purely political perspective is to become more extreme? Because what we've seen from him in the past is if he can't get one of those news cycles, if he can't win one of them, what he does is, for example, question Kamala Harris's race.
I think you're totally right. And Trump has been so consistent in that, when he thinks or he seems to be flailing in any way, he will double down on conspiracy theories, double down on belligerence and aggression. And that, again, that's been consistent. And I think your example of, the way his initial attacks on Harris didn't work, and so he started going after her race, started attempting to delegitimize her candidacy completely, is a tried and tested tactic on his part. And I think especially as, from the outside at least, it appears his campaign is imploding, I think we can expect him to lash out even more. So often, so predictably, you will hear calls for Trump to be more disciplined, more statesman-like, to be a more unifying candidate. He might try it for a couple of minutes at the start of a speech, and then he'll revert back to type. So I think we'll see that again and again.
Do you think that the average Trump voter cares what Nick Fuentes or Candace Owens says about Donald Trump?
I guess that depends on who you think an average Trump voter is, because it is such a loose coalition of quite disparate far-right groups that, will have issues in common, but will often focus on quite different things. And it's been a long-time tactic of the Trump campaign to appeal to those kind of niche bubbles of the internet and build them into a coalition. And that right-wing media universe does spend a lot of time listening to itself. And so I think there will be quite a bit of attention on Nick Fuentes, who you mentioned, who's effectively a white supremacist, and concern internally about kind of what that means, about how people are positioning themselves. But having said that, if we want to talk about the average Trump voter, they are watching Fox News, which is still very much in Trump's camp and is kind of, I guess, deploying a narrative of attack and victimization rather than any of this being Trump's fault. The cult of Trump is still very much alive.
That being the case, we know obviously that the Republican Party is effectively Trump's party now and has been for years. Do these far-right influencers have anyone else that they can latch onto if Trump loses?
There isn't an obvious person at the moment, and I think that partly explains the kind of jockeying that is going on. So J.D. Vance, the senator from Ohio, who's Trump's vice presidential pick, was touted initially, I think, as the kind of heir apparent to Trumpism, and was, I guess, explained as kind of proof that the MAGA movement is bigger than Trump and will continue with a younger generation. the way that his campaign, that JD Vance in particular, has tanked, he's historically unpopular as a vice presidential candidate, kind of suggests that there is no clear alternative to Trump. There isn't somebody who could emerge as an obvious leader of that movement. And that's partly because it is such a loose coalition, as I've described, of these kind of little right-wing fiefdoms. And so, again, I think that's why we're seeing this jockeying happening now in advance of a possible election loss.
Well, it'll be fascinating to watch as we go into November. Emma Shortis, thanks so much for joining us again on The Briefing.
Anytime. Thanks for having me.
Dr. Emma Shortis there. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Briefing. That's it for now. Before you go though, if there's someone in your life who you think would enjoy this episode, please share a link. And if you want to keep up with our other content, you can check us out on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast. We're also on TikTok and YouTube. Just search Listener Newsroom. And we'll be back in your feed with another episode this afternoon from 3. I'm Bension Siebert. Catch you next time.
Listener.